Hello, welcome to Wyoming Interfaith Network's new series entitled Wyoming's Mosaic of Faith. My name is Jordan Bishop. I'm the Executive Director at the Wyoming Interfaith Network. I'm recording a new intro to this video as during the live recording of this event on Monday, February 15th, there was just a disruption in the audio, so I wanted to give you the full introduction before we get into the conversation. Now, in this series, the Wyoming Interfaith Network talks to practitioners, leaders, and experts about religion and faith in the Cowboy State. We seek to educate, celebrate, and have conversations about our rich religious and spiritual diversity here in Wyoming. Our goal is to educate and have these critical conversations about diversity by talking to practitioners, clergy, and anyone that seeks to understand their neighbor better. In the first episode, that you'll see in a minute, is entitled Religion in Wyoming and the West. We'll look at the current demographics of religion in Wyoming, some modern trends, and a bit of the history that led us to where we are today. Our guests tonight are Reverend Warren Murphy, who, among many accomplishments, is the author of On Sacred Ground, A Religious and Spiritual History of Wyoming. And we're also joined by Dr. Tammy Heise, Professor of American Religions at the University of Wyoming. Now I'm going to introduce Dr. Tammy Heise here, and then we will go straight into the video. Dr. Tammy Heise, she is an assistant professor of American Religions at the University of Wyoming. She graduated from Florida State University with a PhD in religion in 2016 and is now completing a book manuscript titled Ghost Dance Religion and National Identity. Her research and teaching focus are on the intersections of religion and politics in U.S. culture, with special emphasis on Native American traditions and the history of the American West. Without further ado, I'll send you to Dr. Heise.
And the nation. So different kinds of settlements in different places attract different kinds of people. This results in different kinds of religious traditions in these areas with distinct beliefs, practices, and perhaps most especially different kinds of public expressions of religion. Some places, like the American South, are quite easily characterized by different streams of evangelical Protestant religion. Others, for example, the Mid-Atlantic coast, are known for Catholic and Jewish populations, mostly as a product of late 19th and early 20th century immigration patterns. States like Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming, however, are better known for something else, namely an apparent lack of religion, or at least a lack of an easily identifiable religious character. In the Mountain West, it's possible to identify some states with clearly defined religious character. Utah and Idaho, for example, are closely associated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormonism. Arizona and New Mexico are also known for Native American religions and Hispanic Catholicism. Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming, however, really don't fit that pattern. In some areas within these states, of course, there are Mormon or Catholic or Protestant enclaves. Butte, Montana, for example, was settled by Irish immigrant miners, and their descendants kept Catholicism dominant there well into the 20th century. Now, however, Billings has Montana's largest population of Catholics. Here in Wyoming, and in Colorado as well, the Episcopal Church has been quite prominent since the 19th century. That sustained presence has a lot to do with settlement patterns, as well as the close connection between Episcopalianism and cultural capital, like educational and professional attainment. In Wyoming, social and political elites often belong to Episcopal churches, and Episcopal churches tend to produce social and political elites. The general rule for Wyoming and its neighbors to the north and south is religious diversity that exists in scattered enclaves with a sometimes relaxed and a sometimes tense pluralism that overlaps, contests, and sometimes transforms boundaries. With that in mind, what exactly do these places have in common? Well, I'd suggest that geography is a starting point for us. The Rocky Mountains and the Continental Divide run through all three states. Those physical features of the landscape are not immaterial to the people who have lived here or who live here now. Several Native American tribes have lived and traveled in this area, and the natural features of this land are of vital importance to their religious practices. Some examples include the Black Hills, the monolith called Bear's Lodge or Devil's Tower, depending on who you might ask, medicine wheels, and much more. Throughout the 19th century, this region also hosted fur traders, overland immigrants, and adventurers like those who hoped to strike it rich in the California gold rush. These men, and they were almost exclusively white men, came from Protestant and Catholic backgrounds in the East. Really, these men came from all over the world, but some of them skipped Wyoming on their way to California, depending on where they started. A very good number of them relished the opportunity to get away from the religious traditions and especially the religious oversight that they had known at home. It was a kind of liminal period for many of them, a temporary experience of freedom before settling back down to responsibilities, including religious responsibilities. Some of these men took this opportunity to experiment with new religious options or to try to ignore religion altogether. There are numerous accounts of miners investigating different religious options, seeking out new Protestant preachers to listen to their sermons, visiting Catholic masses that they might have been warned not to attend had they been at home, expressing both fascination and repulsion concerning Chinese religion. Sometimes their work, especially gold mining, seemed to undermine conventional forms of religion. A miner's reliance on luck often challenged Protestant ideas about industry and success as evidence of salvation. After all, a miner could work all day, every day, without striking gold if there was no gold to be had on his claim. Another man might be an immoral scoundrel who was largely indifferent to work and still get rich in the mines just because he was lucky. These circumstances made it difficult for miners to attribute success or failure to morality or to religiosity. Exposure to religious difference, like Catholics and Protestants working together, could heighten tensions or ease them. So could exposure to religious indifference. Those men who could not or would not tolerate people who adhered to a religion different from their own often left to seek out an enclave in the West that suited them better, or they went back east. Those who were more tolerant of difference or cared less about exclusive claims to religious truth often tried to find reasons to stay in the West. In Wyoming, the railroad was particularly significant. Settlement increased in order to support the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Two important cities, Cheyenne and Laramie, began as end camps on the Union Pacific. Railroads recruited European immigrants, many of them Catholics, so their religious traditions are well represented here. Of course, not all railroad workers practice conventional forms of religion. There are accounts, for example, of railroad workers pooling their money to bring in theosophist speakers. Spiritualists were quite popular in Western settlements too. These men had eclectic and unconventional religious interests and seemed to have enjoyed the religious freedom afforded to them in a sparsely settled region. The story, of course, is not wholly about religious experimentation and tolerance. The newcomers dealt quickly and often violently with Native Americans already living here and supported government-sponsored efforts to interfere with Indian cultures, especially their religious rituals, many of which were banned from the late 1880s until the 1930s. The region continues to be characterized by important enclaves of Indian people, for example, the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming. Religion, in terms of both traditional and more innovative forms like the Native American Church, remains central to Native peoples, but not always well protected by the First Amendment. From a religious studies perspective, it's important to recognize that Wyoming, like all the mountain states except Utah, which is nearly always recognized as a special case, has a substantial percentage of the population that fits into what we call the none category. Now, I don't mean to refer to women who belong to Catholic religious orders. In this case, nun refers to someone who claims no religious affiliation. What that means precisely varies widely. Sometimes it means no religion, perhaps some form of agnosticism or atheism. Increasingly, however, nuns identify as secular, by which they mean they do not have a religion. They tend not to understand religion as a synonym for belief. Sometimes this no religious affiliation signals a reluctance to join a church or disapproval of organized institutional religion. But a nun may still have a serious and possibly eclectic religious life. Sometimes claiming the nun identity really just means mind your own business. It indicates a preference for religion that is private. Not identifying with a religion doesn't necessarily determine whether or not people believe in God. Many nuns say they are religious people, suggesting that institutions, not beliefs, may be what keeps them away from religion. Scholar Philip Deloria puts the percentage of nuns in Wyoming at a little more than 50%. That's similar to Montana at 52% and a little lower than Colorado at 55%. Now, you may be more familiar with surveys conducted by the Pew Research Center and Public Religion Research Institute that have been reported in the press. PRRI's 2017 survey puts Wyoming's percentage at 26% unaffiliated, 21% white evangelical Protestant, and 17% white mainline Protestant. I don't find these surveys convincing because the sample size is too small, sometimes fewer than 100 respondents for all of Wyoming. Deloria's figures, which rely on historical data collected from across the state, are far more compelling. People who don't identify with any particular religion don't fit any particular demographic mold. They come from all races, classes, and educational backgrounds. They do tend to be somewhat younger and somewhat more male, but not always. They also are more likely to be white or Asian. Journalists recently have focused more attention on the effects of religious disaffiliation displayed most prominently among members of the white working class, many of whom don't attend church very often. Religiously unaffiliated Americans tend to be less educated, on average, than many of their more faithful counterparts. Less than 1/3 have a college or graduate degree, placing them below white mainline Protestants, white Catholics, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, and some other groups. But that's not always the case. And the focus on the white working class may obscure as much as it reveals. What is certain, however, is that people who don't have much connection to religion are growing throughout the nation, and they have an increasingly large footprint in places like Wyoming. The reasons that would be the case are complex. Religious disaffiliation isn't new in the United States. The country has always been home to a sizable population who don't go to church or choose not to identify with any particular faith. As a historian, I see religious adherence moving in waves throughout American history. In many ways, early 19th century America looked a lot like what we see in America today, with large groups of people deciding not to associate with traditional religious institutions. Certainly, in recent years, rates of religious disaffiliation have been rising relative to earlier in the 20th century. It's important to remember, though, that religious affiliation was never higher in American history than it was in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Instead of understanding this level of belonging to religious groups as the norm, we should understand that it was an all-time high when approximately 60% of the population affiliated with religious institutions. It had never been that case before, and it is not that way today. In the last 40 years, a great deal has been made of decline among mainline Protestants. This group makes up about 13% of the population today, possibly a little bit higher in Wyoming. According to some observers, evangelical Protestants seem to have escaped these declining membership numbers. If indeed they were bucking the trend, they are not doing so any longer. Over the last decade, numbers of white conservative Protestants have dropped substantially, declining from 23% in 2006 to 17% in 2017, according to recent surveys. White Catholics also saw a decline in this period, dropping 5 percentage points from 16% to 11%. In general, the non-religious states are concentrated west of the Mississippi River, spanning Arizona to Nebraska to Wyoming. And I would suggest that earlier patterns of settlement play a role in that even today, with Wyoming's current population expressing some of the same sensibilities and inclinations as its 19th century settlers. Almost by definition, the nuns are defined by absence. The church services people don't attend, the faith they don't have. But all across the country, and especially in the West, people who don't identify with any particular religion are finding new ways of gathering. For the wealthy, this might involve activities like CrossFit or SoulCycle, which some of you may not consider to be religious at all. For most people, it probably takes other forms. A good deal of it, I suspect, is happening online in forums dedicated to all manner of interests, from gaming to knitting and much more. In communities that are much harder to measure in a survey than traditional church-going. But in an age of religious disaffiliation, it may end up being just as important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Heise. I think there's a lot of interesting points that you made in there. I'm going to wait until the end to ask questions about that. And this is something I could talk about for a long time, but we'll try to keep to our time. Well, thank you. And if anybody does have questions, you can put those in the chat. So please make sure to get those in the chat, and we can hopefully get to address all of those later on. So next, we have one of our own. We have the Reverend Warren Murphy. He's an Episcopal clergy member who has served in Wyoming for over 40 years. He is the ecumenical and interreligious officer of the Episcopal Diocese of Wyoming and the Episcopal representative to the Board of Directors for the Wyoming Interfaith Network. He is also the former director of the Wyoming Association of Churches, the precursor to WIN. In addition, he's the author of On Sacred Ground, A Religious and Spiritual History of Wyoming, and more recently, Unique and Different, Memoirs of a Wyoming Journey. Warren, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And it's good that we're doing this. I think this is great to get a statewide understanding of just the topics of religion and even spirituality. And hopefully that'll grow. Thank you, Tammy, for the good overview, and especially the demographics and also the statistics, because from what I've seen, they're right on. That really is the issue of today that she pointed out. I guess my talk here would be a little bit on fleshing out some of the actual history of all of that. And I know a lot of people think history is dull and don't believe in it anymore, but that's how we got here. And if we don't know it, we make those same mistakes and things all over again. And some of that history has been very colorful, especially as it fits into what Tammy was saying. And I'd start obviously with the indigenous habitation, which is people have been here 11, 12,000 years archaeologically, at least that they've discovered. And they've left their mark. And much of that mark, it's been determined, has been spiritual. And I'd like to point out, and this is my definition, a difference between religion and spirituality. Spirituality is something we all have in a way. We look at it in different ways. Maybe it is knitting or gaming, or maybe it's something that's just out there in the stars or whatever. Something that's touched us that we can't explain, and that's spirituality. And we've had those experiences, and people have always had them. Religion is, I would say, is a human system to design how you better reach that spirituality. And so we all have different ways of doing that. And sadly, that leads to different religious, quote, truths. And so that's where you get a lot of our religious division. But that division can be positive, and that's what we're doing now with the Wyoming Interfaith Network, is trying to bring those understandings together. But in the indigenous world, we still see signs of that spirituality. Rock art sites, which are some of the classic ones, are Legend Rock. Dinwiddie Canyon up by Du Bois has the best probably in the entire state, and the Du Bois area in particular. Vision Quest sites, where Native folks went to really have that spiritual connection. By the way, the BLM now refuses to use the term Vision Quest sites because it's too religious to be tied to the government. So the BLM uses the new term resting platforms. I have a hard time with that one, but and today, as Tammy pointed out, the Native American Church still maintains a lot of those traditions, and it is growing on the Wind River Reservation. So that's just some of our original spirituality came from there. Obviously, when the white influx came in with settlers, primarily the railroad and the miners, people looking for wealth, they were here for their god, which was the god of wealth. And the railroad, of course, went across, and then later people came back. But different folks came with religious ideas to try to bring to the people that were out here, including Native people. And so we have the first white missionaries that came. I'd point out that some of those were Protestants, and I'd like to talk about the first ones, maybe for fun anyway, about the ones that came to Wyoming first, the first white missionaries. And they were Protestant, first of all. I loved that the first actual Protestant person assigned here was an Episcopal priest on the Fort Laramie as the chaplain. His name was Vaux, V-A-U-X, and he played a very important role in what went on at that fort, including the famous massacre of 1854, so-called massacre. I mean, he played a role in all of that, and supposedly started the first school in Wyoming for residents of the fort at Fort Laramie. But the actual clergy that started congregations didn't come until the beginning of the railroad. And I'd point out the first person that got here was a fellow by the name of W.W. Baldwin, who was a Methodist circuit rider. They came on horses. Methodists like to come on horses, keep that circuit going. And I assume he got here on his horse, and he got out there and started the first congregation, actual congregation in Wyoming, in Cheyenne. And right behind him came another fellow who happened to be an Episcopalian. The joke is the Episcopalians waited for the train to get there because they didn't like the horses. So Reverend Joseph Cook was the first person to do that. And I want to just give you a little comment from him because I thought it was pretty good. He arrived by train on January the 14th in 1868, which makes him the first started the Episcopal congregation of what is now St. Mark's. And he was tired after crossing what he called the, quote, dreary, desolate plains. He immediately expressed his dismay at what he saw when he got to early Cheyenne. It was pretty rugged. He proclaimed that excessive gambling amounted to, quote, poor, simple souls selling themselves to the devil. Gives you a little bit about his attitudes. And then he reported back to his bishop in Denver on the illnesses sweeping the city and remarked of the hospital, apparently he had a hospital in 1868. I was very much distressed to find that in numbers of cases, 2 sick men occupied one bed. His attitude was not particularly positive, but he went on to actually start the churches, Episcopal churches in both Cheyenne and Laramie. And then he went back to South Dakota in later years, where he also made some history. But also there were others that came in right after him. Josiah Strong was a Congregationalist who came in and wanted to reform early day Cheyenne. wanted to give options to people who were coming to work on the railroad or another industry, to give them something other than simply drinking. I started First Library. There's a fellow named D.J. Pierce, First Baptist minister. And he started a whole movement to somehow approach the railroads to make them more humanistic, to treat their workers better. And he was known for that. And the first Catholic priest, by the way, arrived in, his name was Father William Kelly. He came much later. Catholics were a little late coming to them in terms of congregations, and it was quite a while before the first Catholic bishop got here. So those all set the scene for those coming into the state. Later on, we saw the early churches as they got started. A lot of it came with a thing called the Sunday school movement. These weren't clergy necessarily. These were lay people. There's one particular one who was very famous. And they went around mostly because a lot of the women who had come to Wyoming wanted education for their children. And those Sunday schools served as educational events where they learned. And usually the congregations would then follow them. And the congregations followed all the railroads wherever they went. So we also saw that in the early years, those congregations tended to be very moralistic. That is, they practiced moralism. It was the thing of the era of the late 1800s and even into the 1900s. And a lot of that happened with being anti-alcohol, anti-prostitution, and also, fascinatingly enough, pro-women's suffrage. And a lot of the churches really pushed that because the women were the ones in charge for the most part, even though the clergy tended to be all male. And that led, of course, early into the 1900s with, and the late 1860s actually, with the women's suffrage movement, of which Wyoming is so famous. And a lot of that because the women were the ones that made things happen. And it was only natural that the first women should be there. And that, of course, led to Wyoming being known as the equality state, which included the first vote, first everything in terms of women, but also the first governor, Nellie Taylor Ross, in 1925. And again, we became known as the equality state, even though, as I think many of you know, we haven't really lived up to that fully, certainly in terms of women's pay and other things. Another thing that's sort of fascinating to point out, because Tammy brought it up, was the Native American experience in the reservation. And of course, that was a tough thing because the first really settlement was the Shoshone Reservation, established by treaty early on, and in 1868 really set its groundwork. And in 1868, President Grant began a new system. He was pushed by the Quakers around the country to take the administration of the reservations away from the army, the military, which they had been, and give it to churches. After all, we're people with moral compunction and the like, and we're going to be good for those Native people. And of course, what happened is that all the reservations in the country were divided up by denomination. And in Wyoming, the Episcopal Church was assigned the Shoshone Reservation. Shoshone, by the way, later on, when the Arapaho got there, became Wind River, but at first it was just Shoshone. And the Episcopal Church tried to do that. They didn't do a very good job. In fact, they hired a Quaker to be the administrator. But they did a number of things that did start religion on the reservations. And it was a very paternalistic type of religion, following the government policy of civilizing Indians. That's a term in quotes, civilizing Indians, which meant trying to make them white culturally. And I think we've all heard those terrible stories of children being sent off to some of the schools, many of them in South Dakota, places like Carlisle and Pennsylvania later on, where many of them were abused, and it was not a good situation. The idea was to make Native people into white people, forcing them to cut their hair, changing names, big name change things. And on the Wind River Reservation, it's reported that all the Native folks were told to show up at the offices one day and get your new name. And reservation officials would assign names to them, many of them just reading them out of dictionaries or English manuscripts. So you have a lot of Shakespeare's and a few others living on the reservation. Terrible way, but that's what happened. In the Episcopal Church had a particular missionary whose name is John Roberts. And Roberts was started in 1883. And he was a little bit different because he really did have an understanding that Native people and indigenous folks needed to have their own lives while accepting Christianity, because Christianity was going to be imposed whether they liked it or not. And Roberts tried to be a bridge to that, to both the white and red communities. And he was pretty successful in doing it, made great friends with Chief Washakie, who not only baptized him close to his death, but buried him. But also a number of other things happened there. And even today, a lot of that legacy is maintained on the reservation. So you have a lot of confused folks who want to be good Christians, but at the same time want their native experiences. Roberts was there, by the way, for 66 years, 66. And he started every church in Fremont County, Episcopal Church. And that legacy lives on. And yet even today on the reservation, it's still a tough go. More recently, and I'll get into the recent years because Tammy brought it up, of things that are happening. I think it's true that one of the things we see is that there are a lot of nuns today. I mean, these denominations did their best. They struggled, they went on. Many of them are still here today and still functioning. Certainly the Catholics have the largest numbers. LDS have large numbers, fitting those statistics. Protestant mainline churches have declined rapidly, as many of us know. And the Catholic Church has also declined in numbers. And also the evangelical groups that started out, and I can't even get into giving their history because there's so many different ones, and they come and they go. But they've been hanging on, and they've also been, I understand, declining in numbers. We do have Jewish inheritance. Jews first arrived here as early as 1873 in Cheyenne. We have had Chinese religion. Most of the Chinese who came with the railroads and then worked in coal mines, especially in Rock Springs and in Evanston. There's a Joss house that was in Evanston. It's been recreated by that city to commemorate their time there. Japanese were here in the internment camp at Heart Mountain, who were really imprisoned there. There's a famous, many churches went in and actually had congregational services there on that internment camp on its site. In the Episcopal Church, there was even one layperson by the name of Luke Yakoda who went on to stay on in Wyoming and become an Episcopal clergy. And there's a stained glass window of him to commemorate his life here, where he worked on the reservation afterwards. That's in the Cathedral in Laramie. You'll see that picture on the wall, a stained glass window. So we've had a lot of that diversity, even though there's not been a lot of it. Certainly the LDS has added to that, especially in places like Star Valley and the Bighorn Basin. Which brings us down to the present time. There have been moves to bring all churches together, at least to talk together, to exist together, and to be a religious force in the state, as well as those spiritual forces that are also out there. And the ecumenical movement itself began in 1965 officially with the Wyoming Council of Churches that brought together mostly the mainline congregations. And that went on to become the Wyoming Church Coalition, which included Catholics and Protestants. Then the Wyoming Association of Churches, just sort of an evolving process that we went through. And then finally today we have the Wyoming Interfaith Network, where we've brought in both Jewish and Islamic inheritance, as well as being open to others. So we've come that way, and most of our emphasis has been on the issues of social justice, because that's always an issue that has been on the front lines in Wyoming. And it's the social justice folks that have pushed Wyoming in a forward direction. And that's an opinion, but I've seen it. We've played a very good role in doing that. And I want to finish with a statement I want to read from my book, which was on sacred ground, which was the religious and spiritual history of Wyoming. But this last paragraph, I think, sums up the role of the churches over these years. And it goes like this. In summary, the faith community, as diverse as it is, has survived and generally prospered. They have managed to leave their mark on the state. Every Wyoming town can display various church buildings and houses of worship. Some are elegant Gothic structures with bells, pipe organs, and stained glass windows depicting the stories of faith. Others are small but quaint churches that serve as reminders of the post-World War II church growth period that Tammy referred to. Some of the newest buildings attempt to emulate the, quote, megachurch, that is, structures found in larger cities and suburbs outside of Wyoming. Large paved parking lots are the symbol of their anticipated church growth. LDS steakhouses with their spires reaching upward are often the best maintained buildings in a community. Well-maintained laws and parking lots say that they are here to stay and that they are open for business. Some churches operate out of storefronts and are not pretentious. Charismatic pastors often run them on minimal budgets. Other storefronts and old historic church buildings are utilized as churches for the growing Latino population. Many of them have taken over some of the old mainline church buildings. Some groups, such as the Quakers, need no buildings at all. Most of these groups would ultimately acknowledge that the church is a community of faith and that the buildings are only instruments of that faith. But what those buildings say is that the faith community has been in Wyoming from the beginning and that it has no intention of going away. Despite its divisions, the faith community has added a sense of stability to every Wyoming town and city. They are mostly taken for granted until a crisis occurs. It is then that the faith community will step up and make it possible for that community to cope. They have provided a sense of community in a state that prides itself on independence. They have provided a sense of something holy in a world that directs itself elsewhere. They have sought out sacred ground, and some feel that they have found it. They all have a story to tell, and they are now telling it. So today marks my anniversary of my 44th year of being in Wyoming. And so I'm pleased that you've asked me to at least touch on that. And my new book, the memoir, explains a lot of that and how it deals with everything in the state, from politics to religion to communities to personal experiences. Glad to be a part.
Yeah, thank you, Warren. Well, we have about another 15, 17 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions for either Dr. Heise or Reverend Murphy, please put them in the chat and we will hopefully get to those. I wanted to kick it off with a question directed towards you, Dr. Heise. You just mentioned quickly in your presentation that Native peoples have often, their religious expression and experiences have not often been protected by the First Amendment. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit as you could.
Sure. Probably the best example, though, to explain why that is, comes from Mormonism. So I'll take a little detour and hope that it will make sense. As most of you know, in the 19th century, the LDS Church practiced plural marriage. And that caused a decades-long anti-polygamy campaign spearheaded by a coalition of American Protestants and the US government. As part of that anti-polygamy campaign, the LDS Church came up with a strategy to try to protect this distinctive religious practice. So quite naively, in my opinion, they decided that they were going to take the US government to court. They would go to the US Supreme Court, and obviously the Supreme Court would find in their favor that they had freedom to practice their religion as they saw fit based on the free exercise clause in the First Amendment. Well, I said naively, so that sort of gives away the ending. That's not what happened. The US Supreme Court found that the freedom of religion applies to freedom of belief, not of practice. So Mormons had no excuse for not conforming to US law because of some religious duty. And that really set the standard for the interpretation of the First Amendment until several Jehovah's Witness cases in the 1940s that expanded freedom to practice a little bit. So this LDS case has lots of significance for anybody who deviates from the Protestant norm in American culture. It's more devastating for Native American groups. So there's this understanding about freedom of religion being belief and not practice that's just sort of common sense within American courts. But Native American religions are not based on belief. They are grounded on practice. And many of those practices need to occur at certain times of the year and in certain places. Sometimes those places are on public land. Sometimes those places are on private land. And there are obviously restrictions for use on many of those sites. Very often, Native Americans have had a hard time winning First Amendment protections for their religious practices. In the 19th century into the early 20th century, that was because many of those practices were just outlawed. They were banned. It was illegal to practice rituals like the sun dance. But even once that ban was lifted, it was still difficult to practice based on restrictions in terms of land use or with peyoteism, restrictions on accessing peyote and having that be something that was legal to possess. Those have, in some cases, been lifted or relaxed, but it's still difficult for Native Americans to win First Amendment protections in some cases.
Yeah, thank you for that. I should just say quickly for everybody here, Wyoming Interfaith Network is the only statewide organization that does look out for both faith and freedom in the state of Wyoming. And so that's something that we will have some more events on in the future because without getting into it, the idea of religious freedom has kind of been certainly co-opted by one group to use in politics today. But as Tammy mentioned, this really impacts religious minorities in the state of Wyoming. And so it's an important issue that people around the state of all faiths should pay attention to. We have one question here from Marcus, and Marcus asks, did revivalist movements have much of a presence in Wyoming? If either of you have something to say about that.
I can respond to that, I think. I would say not really. Again, in the very early days, clergy who came into a town, and we see a lot of this on television and stuff, of, the sort of people coming in with their medicine shows and everything. But a lot of these people who came originally were people who wanted to get away from religion. The Mountain Men, I think, were a good example of that. I mean, they just weren't into that with a couple of strong exceptions. And they were trying to get away from people and religion. They found it very comfortable there, and they don't like things imposed upon them. And in the early days, one of the terms that was used to see people come in and start their pushing religion didn't go over too well with some of the early cowboys and others. I mean, they just weren't into that. They were into an individualistic thing, not coming together to celebrate for anything. And so that was, I just did not find a lot of that in the revival type thing. There were revivals, obviously, especially in more recent years, but nothing that I think you can say really caught on and became a major event. Churches tend to do their own thing separately, quietly, and in many cases did not affect much of what went on in the state, with a few exceptions.
We have probably time for about 2 or 3 more questions, and we have a couple of good ones submitted that I want to get to. We'll go to Katrina and then press. Katrina asks, how are small minority religions counted in the demographics? I find often the only accurate choice is other. Would people who choose other be counted as nuns?
That depends on the survey. And one reason that I don't particularly like some of the surveys that Pew or PRI do, because the sample size is so small. So it's usually around 100 or less than 100 people in Wyoming. And I just don't feel confident in that small sample size producing anything that's representative. So depending on how the survey is structured, somebody who answers other might be listed as no religious affiliation, or just kind of lumped into a group that just says other. So the graph might look like Protestant, Catholic, other, and you'd have no idea what other might include, unless maybe you have some idea of what you might expect to find in Wyoming. These surveys have significant flaws.
Yeah, I've looked at these surveys from Pew and I think PRI, if that's the other one, for a long time. And so when you said that was the first time, that I was like, oh my gosh, I had never realized that survey sample was so low, which obviously can skew the data.
Yeah, it's more reliable when you're talking about trends in the nation, because then you're talking about thousands of people. But Wyoming's small, but it's not small enough to justify such a small sample size.
Right. We can give us more credit than that. So we have a comment and a question here from Press. And Press says, neither of you talked about the fact that wilderness, quote unquote, God's country, often explains the church experience of people who come to Wyoming to be closer to places where they can access wilderness. Most, of course, for recreation, but I have sensed that many feel their church is in the mountains. Could you, either of you, expand on that?
Yes, that's right up my line. And of course, Press Stevens, who asked that question, is a longtime outfitter. So he finds a lot of spirituality, I'm sure, in the mountains up there. Yes, I think that's where the spirituality comes in. Although I will say, first of all, I've heard a lot of people say, I can't come to church today because my God is in the mountains. I've heard that so many times, and it may be true in a few cases, but a lot of times it's just an excuse not to come to church. But no, there is a powerful spiritual force, I think, that is in the mountains, in the desert, in the outdoors, in the creation, and we call that creation care, creation theology, that it becomes the outdoors, especially in Wyoming, becomes an icon to God or to your higher power, whatever you want to call it. Spiritual energy and power comes from there, and by being out there and making touch with it, tremendous things happen. I understand that very well. That's a spirituality. So I understand that people do go into the wilderness, and Jesus, of course, went into the wilderness. The Old Testament is all based on the wilderness and Christian faith. And Jesus' time in the wilderness was to encounter God in a quiet, powerful place that tests all your senses. And if you go into the wilderness with that attitude, you will be tested. And one of the great things about Wyoming, and this is my own personal thing here, but we have grizzly bears. And one of the things, if you like the outdoors and you spend time in those mountains, and the Grizz are out there, like here in the western part of the state, in the Ipsarkas or Wind Rivers now. It's a different kind of hiking. It's a different kind of being there, because you might meet old Grizz on that trail, which I've done a couple of times. And it's a different sense that you are not in charge, that somebody else is in charge. And that grid is a reminder of that. And it makes you understand that there's something greater than all of us out there. And I say a little prayer every time I go on the backcountry. God, I'm not here to harm or destroy any part of this creation. I ask to be at one with it. And at least in my 44 years of doing that so far, it's worked out all right.
There's also a public aspect to it, a kind of public religion that we can, I just finished a unit on this topic with my class on religion in the American West and the formation of the national parks. And the idea that American land is special, that it is divinely created and is evidence of the special providence, special destiny and purpose of the United States, really foundational in the creation of the national parks. A different, less individual, well, still individual, but also government-sponsored or government-supported kind of nature religion. There are many, many options, something for everybody here.
Awesome. Well, I think we have time for one more if we can sneak it in here, because I think it's important. It just happened in the chat, and I know that you answered it, and so I just want to address it real quickly. Chris asked, she's wondering why, if so many Wyomingites are unaffiliated, that it seems that more far-right religious interests are having such an impact on Wyoming's politics. I wonder if you could just quickly respond to that, Dr. Heise.
Yeah, it seems like a contradiction, but I'm going to say that it's really not. So there's a kind of moderating impulse on the right for people who attend church. They tend not to be on the extreme or far right. For those people who are on the far right of the political spectrum, they rarely affiliate with institutional religion. They generally don't practice or engage in other kinds of explicitly religious rituals. But they very often claim a strong Christian identity and connect their far-right politics with a certain kind of Christian nationalism that is, in many cases, not closely attached to any religious group.
All right, thank you. Well, that,
and Jordan,
sorry, go ahead, Warren.
Just a little bit of that, but one of the things I've also noticed in our denominational stuff is that, and I can only speak really for the Christian denominations here, is that we've got a lot of folks who have traditionally always been Republicans. Historically, there was always an even Democratic-Republican split. I mean, that's in our history. That's just been that way until recent years when it's really moved into the Republican realm. But a lot of what we're seeing are Republicans in mainline congregations who aren't necessarily want to go to the right wing. You know, they go back to old time Republicanism when Republicans were financially conservative and nonetheless had a moral calling, and they've always questioned that moral calling. And I know a lot of them were very upset with how the Republican Party has moved to such extreme. Democrats on the other side of that, instead of moving just to the left, they moved out of the state, I think, because there's so few left. And they're just not around anymore. And for some reason, they gave up, you know, their emphasis on doing things that were important and missed the boat. So sadly, we have now a split Republican experience, a Democratic experience that's holding on, but they do find themselves united together for other reasons in many of our churches.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you both to our presenters, Reverend Warren Murphy and Dr. Tammy Heise. There is one more question for each of you that was put in the chat. Where can we see more of your work? Where can we buy your work? Where can people do that? I'll go with you first, Warren.
Yeah, of course I can say that you can find it on Amazon, but you know, Amazon is a conspiracy to do away with the meager income of a few writers, so don't do it. You can find mine on a website called uniqueanddifferent.info. Unique, all one word, uniqueanddifferent.info. Unique and Different is the name of the memoir. It's a 2-volume memoir which covers some wonderful experiences of over 40 years in the state. And the other book can also be obtained, their information for obtaining on Sacred Ground as well.
Unfortunately, my book is not published yet, so it's still in manuscript form. Maybe look for it in about a year. But if you're interested in articles, journal articles, and things like that, you can search in Co-Library. Some of them are available, and some of them are in production right now.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we'll look forward to that, and maybe we'll have you back on to discuss that when it comes out.
It would be a pleasure.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody joining us tonight. As I mentioned, this is the first event in a series. So we are going to be doing more events here in the future on March 22nd at 7:30 p.m. We are going to be joined by Dr. Rabbi Zalman Mendelssohn. I'm giving him too many credentials there. But he will have a great presentation. As some of you may know, Rabbi Mendelssohn, he is a great public speaker, very enthusiastic, and we're just very much looking forward to his presentation on Jewish life in Wyoming. There will be more information on that in the future. If you'd like to stay connected with us, I encourage you to go to yointerfaith.org. And if you go down to the bottom of that page, there will be a section that you can join our mailing list, and that will let you know everything about what our events are coming up, how to get involved in your communities, how to get involved with volunteering with WIN, and a lot more good stuff. I'm going to share my screen just very quickly, if I can figure it out, just to show some very quick information on how to contact us. As I said, this presentation tonight was put on by the Wyoming Interfaith Network Spiritual Life team. If you're involved in helping put on events like this, getting involved in your own community, helping grow in interfaith dialogue, in religious literacy, then I encourage you to reach out. We have a fun group of folks. It meets about once a month. We are led by Katrina Bradley, and her email is on the screen. And you can contact her with more information to get involved. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, and all the other social media stuff. So I will leave it there. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us tonight. Thanks again to our presenters. And we will see everybody soon. Stay warm out there.
Thank you.